Hello, everyone. We are talking today with Dr. Barbara Sumner, thesis Adoptology in New Zealand. She is all things regarding adoption legislation in New Zealand and deconstructing adoption constructs. We jumped right in, so I want to make this little intro to introduce Dr. Barbara Sumner.
That I'm taking that research and breaking it down into small digestible pieces. I mean, the thesis is 120,000 words and it's very dense. And I realized that it was full of important information, but no one's going to read that because it's a very, it's an piece of academic work. And I wanted it to be accessible to the community that it is written about and for.
Can you give me a summary of at the end, what you're trying to get across?
Yes, I can. Maybe might just put some headphones on and see whether I can hear you better.
So in summary for the general public, can you give me kind of the message?
The message of my Substack called Adoptology is that adopted people are owed all the same rights as the non-adopted. And we are constantly told to be grateful, that we are lucky, that adoption is a social good. We are caught within a matrix of social conditioning, and I think where often adopted people themselves believe these stories about themselves. And it's only when we start delving into the structures, the functions, and the purpose of human adoption that we begin to understand how differently we are treated. Specifically, I write about New Zealand, where I live, and about the laws, the legislation, and the judicial rulings in this country. However, in any country that has adoption as part of its child caring system, the intention of adoption is the same.
I see the universality of all of that. I'm in the United States, of course. New Zealand, very different. I don't know all the differences, but historically, that kind of inhumanity to adoptees for not receiving things like birth certificates and all of their information. I feel there's a universality to all of that, of course. And some places might be farther ahead than others. Even in the states, we have 50 states. State by state, the laws are different.
Yeah. And I think that is the important word is the universality, because the intention is the same. The intention is to acquire a child to provide to adults. And to enable that acquisition of a human, you have to set up certain paradigms. You have to set up an idea that a child will be better cared for by someone other than their biological family. And you have to then put in place structures that treat the adopted child as if they are the biological child of their adopters. And of course, I probably need to say up front is that there are always going to be issues around welfare where children are not able to live with their biological families for welfare issues. And I know certainly in New Zealand, we have very specific legislation to manage those welfare situations. And adoption has never been about welfare. It is actually, the legislation is closer to property law than it is to welfare. And it requires a child who's caught in a welfare situation where their biological family are unable to care for them should not have to pay for that dysfunction within their family with the loss of their identity for all time. A welfare situation with a child is a temporary issue, and adoption is a permanent solution. That adopted child becomes an adult and must pass that falsified identity onto their descendants.
How much research have you done into the history of why this has become this way? I'm curious. Because I do not know, say 1,000 years ago, a child needed a home or a child was kidnapped or captured, whatever the circumstances are. We didn't have the laws that we have now. And you can imagine that if a mother's child was taken, she would go back to take the child, and maybe the village that she lived in would have to convene and say yes or no. And then became some kind of system where laws are written and every adoption has to be this way. And then it becomes a closed adoption, probably because mothers were given their children back, right? When they got better or whatever the problem was resolved. And people wanted permanent adoption. The mother cannot come back. This is what I imagine is how these laws, right?
Yeah.
And rightfully so in many scenarios because that kind of disruption is horrific. However, the way the laws have been written are clearly to the disadvantage of us, the adopted persons, once we've grown up. Maybe we've always been curious. Every adoptee story is so singularly different, right? Like I found out I was adopted when I was 11 years old, and I was adopted at birth. Every piece is significant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
It
was a
is.
baby scoop era person, I think, as you know who Moses Farah is, right?
I do
I
know.
think that because of social media, we're reaching a tipping point of a universality of we have a big problem with what's happened here. We're all feeling and thinking and saying the same things. And then putting the pieces of history together, I think, is vital because how did it get this way? This is the way it is right now. And then, of course, this is what needs to change and this is how it should be. So, historically, how do you think we got here?
Great question. And there is a very clear social progression that we can track quite easily. So in New Zealand, we had, and we still have sort of a system called whāngai. And that's a Maori word. Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And it was the way that they took care of children for all time, where children knew that they were being cared for by an aunt or a cousin or what have you. And there was no paperwork around it. And children were always cared for within the whānau, which is another Māori word that means family. And children were not left out and off there, were not taken by strangers. There was no secrecy. And in 1955, New Zealand came up with it's not its first adoption act, but its first adoption act that is now in the modern way. And they decided that it was discriminatory that Māori should have the same advantages as non-Māori people, as European people, and so they outlawed whāngai and this beautiful system that worked really well. And while we still have that system, the people who are whāngai'd are adopted in exactly the same ways. And a lot of it was to do with the advent of the nuclear family. So you have a single mother who is pregnant. A single mother does not fit the nuclear family. Neither does an infertile married woman. So there seemed to be an obvious answer to this problem. We'll take the babies from the single mothers and we will pass them over to the good married mothers. Before 1955, in my country, women who were single, who were unable to look after their children, gave their children, their children were cared for by other people, but the mother had to cover that cost and was required to be involved in the child's life. So adoption as we know it didn't exist then. Now, of course, and we still have this piece of legislation, 70 years old. It's never been updated. It is still, we are still treated as if it is 1955. And the underlying issue is that the biggest behind it all is the issue of succession and inheritance. And closed stranger adoption, where children were, baby scooped and uplifted, enabled men to continue with their lives without any future concern that inheritance and succession would be available to their illegitimate children. So it really was about changing the status of a child from illegitimate to legitimate.
Wow. Yeah. When you were speaking, it was like 1955, World War II, the beginning of the baby scoop era, 1940. I am told in France, and I don't know where else in the world this is true, when a man dies, his estate goes through the government and his illegitimate children are provided for. I need to validate that information potentially if we talk about that.
Yeah.
In
I
the
don't know
United
about that.
States, we had orphan trains. Do you know about that?
I do. Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing what's happened in the 20th century, right? Children were just given away, put on a train, dropped off wherever because somebody said, okay, you're with me,
Yeah.
into this market.
Yeah.
And it's all seemingly post World War II, which, millions of people died. There were millions of children who needed homes, and these laws were written.
Yeah. They were written, and there were children, obviously, children who were very displaced and needing care. And so when you when you look at it from that perspective, of course, that's a good thing. But no child should have to, every child is deserving of love and care. But no child should have to pay for that love and care with the loss of their identity. Now, of
Okay.
course, you've got children who are caught in wars whose identity may be lost for all time. But not that's not the condition since that time. And yet we're still treating all people who have become available for adoption, and we set up systems to make people available for adoption. But the 20th century particularly was about the commodification of children
I agree.
and the rights of adults to use anyone's child, another woman to use another woman's child to build her family or to resolve her infertility.
When we adoptees are trying to explain and we get cut off and people refuse to understand this glaring issue, I was just thinking as you were saying it, I think anyone would understand that it's a tragedy and something to be grieved if a child were to lose its information. So, say if you had a highly publicized case of a child losing its family, however, this would come about, that a person is whatever age, I don't know how to formulate this scenario, but we're trying to explain this to other adults in order to change things. So, if you said to an adult, if you lost all of the information about your family, how would that make you feel? If you literally lost all of that information, all the tangible information that you have about your grandparents and great grandparents, etc., it was all lost. And you can liken the tragedy to something like a fire, right? Where everything is burned. Say your history is in a box and you've not opened it, and you're 21 years old, and you're saving it for when you're 21 years old, and you're waiting to open it because it has all the information about all of these relatives and your ancestry, and there's a fire, and that box of information is gone for good. How would that make you feel?
Yeah, it's a very good question, isn't it?
We have to try to explain it and explain it and explain it because we've been disenfranchised.
Yeah.
So we continually try to come up with these examples for people to understand how we feel about things.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
it's so, am in the habit of saying, if somebody doesn't understand, it's because they don't want to understand. Because this is not that difficult to grasp,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The issue is certainly in the legislation in New Zealand, it's come down, I think, this entire act has come down to two words. And those two words are as if. And the act says that you are as if born to your adopters. And that is that idea that you're talking about someone losing all of that. Adoption says that you haven't lost all of that because you've been given all of this. And this is as if your own information. And we're saying, hold on, it's not. I mean, we have issues in our health issues in our family that are likely genetic, but we have no right to that information. One of the things I find most difficult is that I walk into to see a new doctor. I have to be at the hospital for something, whatever. My status as an adopted person is always up front because I can't answer those questions. So suddenly I am an adopted person, and the idea of this adoptological family, which is considered identical to a biological family, it starts to fall apart. And, anyone can see that, even if it is just on a health issue. But we don't want to see it. So we continue to gaslight ourselves and society. It's a top-down network gaslighting that says that there is no difference, that all you need is love. These kinds of ideas are so flawed as to be nonsensical, but we still adhere to them all the time.
I like the fact that a year, because we can see it was a warped interpretation that began in the I like the analogy that I just concocted about the fire.
Hmm.
So, like what you're saying, if your entire house burns down in a fire and somebody just picked you up and said, "Okay, now you're over here in this house. Look, I've given you a new house." You still lost the old house and everything in it, and it was very upsetting, even though you have a new house. It's not the
Yeah.
same.
I have
You
I have
experience
an
loss.
an example of that. A number of years ago now, our neighbors, there were two little children and the parents, and they were in a terrible car accident. The parents and one of the children were killed. And so there was one small child left, a baby. And they were an older couple, older parents, and there was no one in their family that could care for the child. So that child was adopted. The people who adopted the child were very good, and they brought her back within our community and introduced her to us as she got older, and we did a little plaque to her family, and that was great. But that child still legally lost everything, was given a new birth certificate with her adopters as birth parents. Every single piece of information that was held on her she is unable now, she's in her 30s now, she is unable to access any of that information. Even though her adopters were people that wanted her to recognize what had happened and that her family had been killed. So it's this absolute ownership that comes from adoption. And one of the things that I find quite a difficult thing is that yes, two people, a couple of any type, adopt a child. A newborn is obviously, we like fresh babies the most, but adopt a child, but the rest of their family don't adopt that child. Their parents, grandparents, great grandparents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, they don't adopt a child. Everybody is always aware that this child that is being brought up as one of their own, there is always that sense of not. Because we are tribal people. We are made of blood. That is who we come from, deep lines of blood. And it is only human that we prioritize the well-being of our blood to continue our genetic lines. This is what we've always done. Adoption doesn't change that. It just plonks a stranger child in the middle of a stranger family.
I'm just Googling the years. Slavery became illegal in the British Empire in 1833 and in the United States 1865. So in that 19th to 20th century, we've had so many social changes and laws being written, civilization, what have you. I've been having an interesting thought around the term slavery and how we never use it. But in what other instance are you literally removed, name changed, and demanded to adopt whatever scenario you are brought into? And, we talk a lot about commodification and that whole transactional aspect of it. And how is it different?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a difficult question to ask.
We
It's a
have
good
slave
question.
records that way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think for an adopted person is that we are acquired most often, but not always, by people who need a child, desire a child to build their family, to resolve their infertility. So the moment you are acquired, you are in a performative role. You are performing the role of the child that they could not or would not have, chose not to have. And that is a job. That's a job description that you can never quite fulfill. You are in some way always under observation to see how well you are performing that role and where you are not performing that role. So there's this constant, within an adopted person's life, there's this constant balancing of who they are, how they fit, how they're performing. And others are watching them as well. The wider family that you're adopted into is also watching to see how well you are like them, how much you look like them, don't look like them, sound, your voice, your humor, your intellect, your the things that your sport or your hobby or whatever it is. And you are required at all times to try and match that environment, that family that you've found yourself in. So that's a job. That's a full-time job from the moment you are acquired.
Yeah.
And whether it is a family building exercise or a saviorism exercise where you are, taken by people of religious belief who want to indoctrinate you into that belief because it's a better way of life. I mean, there's that whole better life theory that adoption provides. And we know that the better life theory doesn't work. We have in New Zealand, we have no outcome studies, zero. So we've had a 70-year social experiment with not a single adult outcome study. We have one outcome study in 17-year-olds from the mid-90s that showed that the adopted people in this study were adopted into good white middle-class families. They had all the advantages of those families: extracurricular activity, holidays, nice homes and nice suburbs, great schooling. And yet, despite all this, they had higher rates, significantly higher rates, of all negative externalizing behaviors: sexual behavior, cigarette smoking, abstinence from school, all kinds of truancy issues, all of these negative behaviors. And the conclusion of that study was that the results were paradoxical because of the quality of the homes, the perceived quality of the homes. Therefore, it must be the bad blood of the mothers.
Instead of the act of adoption.
Of adoption itself.
And the coercion.
Correct.
Yeah. The interpretation is entirely flawed.
And so we still hold, this is it's a 30-year-old study. It's the only one. We still have those beliefs. And if there is a problem in your adoption, i.e. the adopted person is behaving in a problematic way, that is the adopted person's personal issues. It is never adoption itself that is considered to be the issue. Or most often adopted parents, because they are considered to be a better type of person because of this altruistic act they have done, putting all their energy and resources into bringing up someone else's child. Yeah.
The investment that they made.
Their investment.
Yeah. It's long awaited to scream from the rooftops that adoption itself is trauma.
Yes.
Even though you can compare, and I'm a physician and I belong to a psychiatry group, and we just had this little informal meeting, and somehow I brought up the work that I'm doing lately, and I said adoption trauma. And somebody immediately cut me off, and she said, "Why would you say it's trauma?" And I said, "Well, what would you call a child who has no parents, who has to be adopted by another family? There's trauma." And you can see the tension in this Zoom call with 6 or 8 people and the silence that ensued. But she immediately cut me off when I said trauma associated with the word adoption. It's reflexive.
Yeah, it
and
really
many,
is.
Many people, so there's 300 and almost 40 million people in the United States. And I get these statistics of somewhere between 7 million and 9 million people are adopted in the United States, about 2% of the population. Now, I was adopted, but I had 2 parents, a brother, and a number of extended people in my family. I've been married twice, and then, of course, I have biological people, if you want to include everyone. There are a good 20 to 30 people that are associated with singularly one adopted person. That number might be a little bit high. You can take it down to 20 or 15, but that makes if there's 10 million adoptees, multiply that by 15 or 20 or 25, that's a lot of people involved in adoption.
Yeah. Well, we say here 16% of the country have some involvement with adoption. Right. When you factor in all of those, from both.
Yeah, I'm figuring it's at least about that, between 10 and 15%, somewhere around that number. That is significant.
It is. I think when we talk about adoption trauma, I think one of the problems, and this just folds back to what you were saying before that Moses Farrow says as well, that because of the secrecy that is embedded within it, the lack of information, the inability to access records, and the way we are, adopted people have struggled until now to have a collective voice because we are each siloed within our stories, because all we have is stories, and those stories are individual. And so we are individualized rather than understanding that there is this collective trauma, this collective group. And because people are adopted into all manner of families, we are we're as diverse as any group of people. Well, we are more diverse probably than any group in the community of people. So how do we find a common voice when we are all of us fighting against secrets and lies within ourselves, within our families, within society in general? And so that finding that collective voice is the hardest thing. Once that reaches some kind of momentum, and I know Moses talks about that, this will improve, because adopted people will say, I have these are my issues, and another 100,000 people say, I've got those same issues. And I know that within some of the groups that I participate in, we are starting to talk about the ways that we are in the world, and we are realizing that they're not peculiarities to individuals. They are actually psychological responses to the grief that we feel in our bodies and in our minds of having been separated from everything that is real and being forced to live in this false paradigm.
I had a meeting with a few other adoptees because I started these groups here in the Phoenix area, and we got into pretty deep discussion about, somebody brought up suicidal feelings. And there's a taboo talking about suicide, as there is a taboo talking about adoption trauma. There is no way other than to look at it as this feeling, whether you carry it out or make an attempt or not, is so common, it needs to be put into an almost normal category. It's a risk factor.
It is a risk factor. This is absolutely right. I'm still trying to find, that we don't have any studies in New Zealand. We have zero data again across every single metric and every single government department. We have no data on adoption outcome, to the extent that the coroner does not even record adoptive status of people who have taken their own lives. We don't know the adoptive status of incarcerated people, anyone going into a drug treatment program. If you don't code for it in some way, then it doesn't exist. And yet we now are starting to speak, and we know that it exists.
The stats exist. They just have to be configured properly.
We have no stats in our country, so none at all. That's the problem.
The accumulation globally of the data can be extrapolated to every society. There's no way you can say that the suicidality issue is 40% in adoptees only in part of the world and not over here.
I agree with you completely. Thank you.
The statistics, in my opinion, so I was doing, insurance-based family practice up until recently, and you have to fill out, like what you're saying, when you go to the doctor, when a doctor asks you about your lifestyle choices, like recreational drug use or smoking, it's a risk factor.
Yes.
I believe adoption is a risk factor that needs to be accounted for in the doctor's office. And the doctor, if they put adopt it, when they're clicking all the boxes, when you go to your primary care physician, click on adopt it, an entire thing should drop down for age groups, and questions should be asked. How are you processing your adoption? Do you have feelings of harming yourself? Do you have problems with addiction? Even though they're kind of asking them differently, to pull that together under the heading of adoption and educating doctors. This is a high risk category of individuals.
I could not agree with you more. It is absolutely essential, and I certainly know in my country that it is unlikely to happen, but it's essential. I mean, on top of those adoption created risk factors, such as suicidality, there are also genetic risks as well. obviously. And for me, the family that I was brought up in have not only no genetic connection, but who I am, my grouping of people in the world, are predisposed to certain illnesses, certain risk factors, and that's never been recognized before, until, that is not recognized at all. And I find that is pretty outrageous, actually.
Yes.
And another interesting thing, again, a personal anecdote, that I was injured as just a preteen by my adopted father. And it required surgery and to remedy the issue. And they said at that time, there was such a nice couple that nobody ever thought to ask anything else. My injury was put down as a genetic problem because I was adopted. They were able to hide behind my adoptive status and
Right.
avoid any form of any issue around abuse. So a genetic defect was actually what it was described as. So again, just a small thing, and I know that's not that common, but again, another way that adoptive status can be used.
Discrimination wise, within the family system, all kinds of behaviors and thing, every time a child gets upset or every time a child has feelings of depression, etc., it can be blamed on some kind of genetic influence and go completely unrecognized in a proper way, get treatment for it. I'm going to go so far as to say it's medically negligent to not look into these risk factors for identity behaviors, children acting out. I know a lot of adoptees are wildly offended by the diagnosis reactive attachment disorder.
Yeah, well, because it puts the blame on the adopted person.
That's correct.
Rather than the system itself.
Yeah, rather than the situation causing an inability.
I mean, some of the things that I struggle to accept is that you take a child, a small child or a newborn, an infant, and you take them away from everything that they know, which is the mother. Obviously, the whole world is the mother. You remove them from the mother and the world ceases. Everything stops at that point. And then that child who is existing in a bodily form, that body is taken and used by strangers to meet their own need, whatever that, the physical need to hold a baby and do the mothering. And so the child is constantly being used by strangers who they must then, out of survival, connect with. And you then start performing and acting as if you are that child, their child, because how else do you survive? We are hardwired for survival, so we'll do what it takes. Doesn't take into account the psychological pressures that causes. You're never yourself.
It does take it into consideration in other studies, and then it's just not applied properly.
Right.
Like their orphan syndrome, these writings are forever.
Yes.
Right? But you're not calling an adopted child an orphan.
No.
Like, all you have to do is apply it there.
Yeah, you are. You've been made an orphan. You're a paper orphan with everyone still living.
A decree of adoption does not wipe away, that the child is removed or just transferred to another family as if the parents have died. That's what the child experiences, a total loss of connection to their biological family. It's as if they died.
I mean, if your mother dies,
without any explanation.
If your mother dies in childbirth or shortly after, you're considered to be a posthumous child, and that a posthumous child is surrounded by stories of their mother. By the grief of others, and their own grief is acknowledged. And as you grow up, the grief at the loss of your mother is part of your story, and it's an acknowledged part. An adopted person, for an infant taken from their mother, it is as if the mother has died. The mother is dead for them. That grief is in every cell, but no one acknowledges it. Instead, you are being told in every possible way that you must be grateful and happy because you've got these people came and took you, saved you. And so even the concept of grief becomes twisted.
Yes, ambiguous and disenfranchised.
Ambiguous. Ambiguous
I
grief.
personally, I'll share a personal on that topic experience. So I found out I was adopted in the sixth grade. And in the seventh grade, in my little school, a girl that I knew, her mother passed away. And it was
Right.
very tragic. And she got an outpouring of support, all of us,
Yeah.
there were maybe 50 or 60 kids per each grade, right? And it was Catholic school, so we went to mass and we said prayers for her and her family and her mother, and it was this unbelievable, beautiful coming together, right? And all of us were sensitive to her. I remember going home and looking in the mirror and pretending as if my mother died and receiving support. I used
Wow.
to fantasize that I was at my own mother's funeral and I was receiving an outpouring of love.
Yeah. Amazing.
But in my young mind, and even into my adulthood, I thought I was fantasizing that my adoptive mother would die and that I wanted her to.
Yeah.
And that is the essence of disenfranchised and ambiguous grief, I think. I didn't know what I was grieving, but I was literally envious
Yeah.
of the beautiful support that she had in her grief.
Yeah. I
And
get
I
that.
was happy to provide it. And I didn't understand that I was craving it
Yeah.
because I had experienced a loss because everybody said I didn't lose anything.
I mean, yeah, no, nobody has acknowledged that. And still people don't. In my situation, that same situation, I was taken from my mother as an infant, supplied to a childless couple. And when I found my mother in my early 20s, she was killed on her way to meet me. So then I had a second loss. And that second loss, that second grief, it was nobody knew how to comfort me. And there was no comfort available because you didn't meet her. What's your problem?
Yeah, what's your problem?
And I remember taking a photograph and telling my adopters about her and that she had died, how she had died and that she'd died. And I had this single photograph of my male adopter, took that photograph out of my hand, ripped it in half and threw it across the room and said, "There's your mother." And so there was I dared to step outside of the narrative that had been created for me. And that broke the relationship. This very relationship between adopters and the person in their care is very fragile. And it
Yes,
requires the adopted person, to constantly
force it.
satisfy, reinforce it. Yes, reinforce it.
I wanted to search in my adulthood. So I was told I was adopted by my mother, and she said, I don't want to talk about it again.
Yeah.
I had extended family who came to me only then and said, don't worry about it. We all love you and you're part of this family. And then never talked about it again. And then as I was in grad school and I was like, I want to search. My adopted brother, who I grew up with, was upset that I was going to do it.
Same. I had that
My
situation.
father didn't say anything directly to me, but he was very upset and said to my mother, is she going to leave us?
Yeah.
He never found the words to ever talk to me directly about it.
Yeah.
So there's all this shame around it. She was like, oh, that's not a bad idea, and was kind of supportive one on one. And even I found out I was Irish, and she bought me a keychain that had a big 4-leaf clover on it. And that was a gesture, but we
Mm.
couldn't dialogue about it.
No.
So it was just this, I know I'm doing something that's upsetting people. My brother was very upset. And it was again something that we have to go through all of this alone.
We
We have no
do.
one to bounce our feelings off of around this until we get to be a certain age. And I
Yeah.
feel like I live two different lives. One out in the public where I'm working on myself and I have friendships and I can talk openly about it. And at home where it can never be brought up and it's the performative, theater where I have to be this person that they've always known. And therein lies the divide.
Yeah. No, I understand that. Uh, I have to say, I'm sorry for my family. I have a number of children and grandchildren, and they are so tired of me talking about adoption and having done a PhD in the issue. They're tired of it. But again, when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about second generation. We understand that the children of Holocaust survivors have very specific and quite actions and reactions and behaviors that are related to that inherited trauma.
Yes.
But we don't talk about the families, the children and grandchildren of adopted people. And it's only now at my this mature age that I understand that I parented in a very specific way that was related entirely to being an adopted person and having no family, nobody to turn to, basically stranded. And I ended up being, in the end, as a single parent, stranded alone, bringing up my children. And my adopter's attitude was, well, you've made your bed, you have to lie in it, that type of thing. But because there was no family, there was no wall behind me, there was no sense of being part of something greater, a genealogical, narrative, I put a lot of pressure on my children to meet that need in me, to be my family, because they were my only family. The first person my oldest daughter was the first person I'd ever met that I was related to. That's a lot of pressure that goes on to them as well. And it's unacknowledged and unrealized at the time, and it's unfair.
Couple things I want to circle back on the Holocaust. I remember saying in my 20s when I was about to do a search, I had a very close friend who was Jewish, and I certainly didn't mean to insult. And again, I'm trying to get him to understand. But I said, my life feels like my own personal Holocaust.
Yeah.
Jewish people have a collective Holocaust that unifies them. I feel like I have my own personal Holocaust.
Yes. We have no language.
Said something like, don't use that term or something. It's just shunned. It's just shut down.
Yeah.
And when we try to give these analogies over and over and over, and, we can't claim anything. And I'll go back to what I had said earlier of slavery.
Yeah.
So
Again.
African Americans know exactly where, if it's their great-great-grandfather that was a slave and they're descendants of slaves, and they have the luxury that we don't of knowing those people. The records were better kept. We, in the 21st century, had all of our record keeping erased, and we were told, this isn't happening to you.
Yeah.
This is how you're going to go into the world.
Yep.
So I'm reading a book, and I had met the author. His name is Dr. Boris Gindis, and he makes the analogy of modern day adoption is an experiment.
Yes.
And it's being conducted by a very evil, very warped, sick scientist. And that children, and he focused his practice entirely on internationally adopted children. He is Russian himself, and he practices in the United States, and he'd been here for many decades. So he kind of had a specialty of internationally adopted children from Eastern Europe. And he would assess these children with their adoptive parents, and he would educate the parents. This is, post-orphanage behavior. This is how they are. This is trauma. And many parents didn't want to hear the word trauma. What do you mean? The adoption agency did not tell me about this. Very well known. You're saying, obviously, universal trauma. And they don't believe him.
No.
And I actually sent a family to him about 10 years ago for this very reason. They adopted an Albanian boy, and I was counseling them, and I was treating this child for anxiety and all these behaviors that he was exhibiting that his parents were so concerned about. And I'm trying to explain to them an orphanage, in plain terms, is baby jail.
Yeah.
And they're just not believing me.
Yeah.
They refuse to believe that a child could spend 2.5 years in an orphanage and somehow have some sort of damage. So I literally referred to Dr. Gindis because I was like, I need some backup here.
Yeah.
The narrative around adopted children is so reinforced.
It's different to every other narrative. It is a special state separate from all others.
It's reinforced. It's an absolute bias.
Yeah.
Where you are not going to tell me your personal truth and feeling about being adopted. I am not going to accept that. You are lying. Or you are great. Maybe you are mentally ill.
And until we have a collective language.
And that is gaslighting. 100%.
Yeah, it is. It is gaslighting. We need, until we have a collective language where we understand that it is not about good or bad adoption. We love to play. That's the binary that we use. If you've got a problem, it's because you had a bad adoption.
Right.
But I know someone who had a fabulous adoption. They're fine. They have no problem. It is not about good or bad adoption. It is about the ways the multitude of ways in which adopted people are treated differently to all other people, all non-adopted people, no matter where they're from. And the unifying issue with adopted people is the siloing. Everyone is individualized and siloed within their stories. So in the end, all we get to do is tell our stories, rather than there being this generalized understanding that our stories spring from the structure. And once we start to demolish or understand that the structure is what causes it, then we begin to give power back to the people who are the victims of that structure. And we are using adopted people against each other by saying they had a good one and they had a bad one. I had a particularly
I've
bad adoption, but that's not why I'm the way I am, why I'm so determined to uncover the structures. It's because the structures are the root cause of the problem.
Now, are you in practice? Are you a psychologist or something? Do you have patients?
I don't. I teach memoir writing. I have a memoir of, my PhD's in creative writing, and it's a hybrid with adoptology, the study of the structures and functions and purpose of adoption.
As a physician, have a particular penchant for getting to the root. I'm a naturopathic physician, and it's in my oath. Get to the root cause.
Yeah.
Look at the spectrum of issues
Yeah.
that are not put in the root cause category. Generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder. And you are talking about adoption trauma, unrecognized, disenfranchised, and ambiguous. And you are going to give everybody the same pill.
Yeah.
And in the adoptee, it's not going to work, is it?
It's not going to work. In fact,
It
I
might
can recognize.
But it might positively be absolutely the wrong thing to do and increase their suicide risk because they are losing hope. Because what they need is trauma therapy.
Knowledge and acknowledgement and understanding of that it exists.
Can I please tell you my terrible therapy story?
Yes.
I was raised in a very Catholic location, and I went to Catholic schools until I was 21 years old. I went to a Jesuit college even. I was never in a diverse environment whatsoever. Everybody was Catholic. So I am in my mid-20s, and I need to talk to somebody. I have a lot of stress. So I find this woman, and she does not identify herself to me as a Catholic nun. I did not know. And I am talking, of course, about family problems, and I'm adopted, and I'm adopted by this family, and I'm having so many problems with the way that my mother behaves to me and the way my father behaves to me and my brother behaves towards me. And she is not too bad at the beginning and eventually sort of loses her temper at me and tells me that I am ungrateful and arrogant. And sometimes she feels as if she'd like to slap me. Isn't that an archetype classic nun?
Yes, it is. Who is expressing adoption narrative. One of the things that I always think of, and this might seem very left of field, when I talk to adopted people, one of the questions that I ask is, how does your adoptive mother smell to you? Do you like their smell?
Right.
And it takes a while. People have to think about it. And
sensory experience you're evoking, yes.
And most commonly, when they think about it, they go, "Oh my God, I do not like the way she smells." And I understand that as being, from my research, of course, our smell is our first, as we are being born, smell is the first sense that is activated. You put a newborn, you're a physician, you understand, you put a newborn on the mother's stomach, the child will crawl to the breast, not because, and they can't crawl, but they will move to the breast naturally. It's not because they're hungry, but because the areola exudes an oil that is identical in its olfactory makeup to amniotic fluid. That is the beginning of that. That is the next stage of being in utero. It's part of the being born process, which lasts for another 3 months. You take a child off a mother before that happens and put them physically on the body of a non-related person. That smell is all wrong. And you know it without knowing it. And it becomes so deeply embedded that it takes this time of going, do I like the way she smells as an adult to begin to understand it. And I realize I still, until, I mean, I don't see my adoptive mother anymore, but, the last time I saw her a year or so ago, I have to hold her out here because
It's
the
affecting
smell is wrong. And there's nothing wrong with her smell. She smells perfectly fine to everyone else. But my body reacts to it. And when I start
aversion.
talking,
You
I
have an
have
aversion
I have an
sorts.
aversion. And that's
Yes.
not her fault
No.
at all. It
Right.
is a natural, scientifically proven response to the forced physical intimacy
Yeah.
of human adoption.
And who knows what kind of genetic coding we are literally processing with our olfactory sense. We still don't understand that, of course,
No, we
right?
don't. No, we
But
don't.
yes, it's completely foreign and it's not what we want. And it's totally new and it creates, and this is the crux of my work with adoptees, fear.
Yeah, absolutely. It is.
A child adopted and taken immediately creates a fear complex in the child. And I feel in utero memories, the fear that the mother was experiencing potentially during the pregnancy, potentially also during the birth. Fear is a major factor
That's
in
the
adoptions.
epigenetic memories. We all carry them.
Yeah, and I think a natural childbirth without adoption, if a birth wasn't going right, I mean, I've hung out with plenty of midwives. In fact, I still share an office with a midwife now. Uh, they're ultra aware of birth trauma, and I've heard so many birth trauma stories of how women were treated during their birth in the hospital, and they want to have a home birth and they want to have an attentive midwife and privacy. And birth trauma stories are universal and listened to and accepted and nurtured. But birth trauma stories of adoptees are entirely shut down.
Highly shut down. And that
We
is
are
why,
marginalized and we're a significant piece of the population and we are so utterly marginalized
yeah.
in
And that's
every way.
and that's
Our
backed up by law.
existence, our virtual existence is marginalized.
Yeah. And that's backed up by legislations that ensure that that continues. So it is a stranglehold of social expectation and social understanding and societal understanding and legislation. They are in lockstep together to deny us to deny a reality and to promote the narrative of as if born to the people that you are supplied to.
And adoption, once you get, it's the Fibonacci sequence. You just continually have to keep renewing your own narrative and your own story because it is our identity. It's not I was adopted. It's I am adopted.
Yeah.
It is literally a piece of it is your identity. That is
Yeah.
who you are. It's
Yeah.
not what happened to you. It's who you are.
Yeah, it is because we end up spending, certainly every adopted person I know, so much of our time and energy in kin making. That is all we're doing. We are hardwired to try and connect back to what we have lost. The other day,
Abandonment again.
yes, just earlier this week, I have a cousin in the States, lives in Port Robert, and we have the same great grandmother, and he was going through his mother who's passed away, her files, and found a whole lot of photographs of our shared relatives. So there's one there that is from just over 100 years ago, and it is my grandmother, her four sisters, so my great aunts, my uncle, my grandmother's first child, and my father. So this line
Wow.
of the most standing in front of a house they own in the middle of London, in a beautiful area in London. And it is the most beautiful photograph, and I cannot stop looking at it. I can't stop looking at those beautiful women
That you never met.
that you've never met. It's not that you haven't met them, because of course, 100 years we wouldn't have met, but they would have been part of my family lore. They would have who they are, what they did, how they lived, their occupations. Those things I would have grown up with. So when we talk about kin making, it's not just about finding a relative. It is about trying to, it's like when you cut off a limb and all the nerve endings are alive and believe the limb is still there. We are like that. We are amputated from our wider story. And so all our nerve endings are alive with that loss. And all our nerve endings want to do is reconnect to it. I would never have met them unless I can, do time travel or something. But I could see various members of the family that I've created, my children and grandchildren, in their faces and their bodies and a number of other things, a couple of health issues that are obvious there. And you realize that this is what the work of my life has been, is actually being kin making in the attempt to be whole. Now, I try and pass that on to my children and grandchildren, and, my children are certainly interested, but my grandchildren are not. They're too young. It's just me raving on about stuff. But one day they will be interested because it's their story as well. So my
Yes.
adoption 65 years ago is their story too. And it's their story of loss as much as it's my story of loss. Because right now, we legally sit on the family tree of strangers. And those people that I can see in that photo and many others, they're just social relations. I have no legal connection to them. That is a social relationship only.
Correct. My husband, who's deceased, would tell me about his family story. And he didn't think he had any kind of, like, we would have these long talks, and he was probably sick of hearing about adoption too, right? But he was born from a family. So his grandmother, his paternal grandmother, was Gypsy, not Jewish, but her entire family was wiped out in the Holocaust.
I know another family of travelers who were wiped out the same. They were targeted in the same way.
And it wasn't revered as like a Holocaust story, Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
She was a true Holocaust survivor, but because she was Romani, it wasn't socially accepted and globally known. I mean, the Romani were almost utterly wiped out.
Yes, they were. Yes,
And
they were.
her entire family was gone. And she married an American, and she was pregnant with twin boys, and only one survived. And that was my husband's father. And he was already deceased when I'm hearing the story from my husband. And I said, and he said, my father always felt, guilty that his twin had died and sorry for his mother because he was part of a twin, and he felt all these feelings. And I said, don't you think? And his father took on the burden of being responsible for his mother's unhappiness because she had very disenfranchised grief also.
Yeah.
And I said, don't you think your poor grandmother was grieving the loss of her entire family? And you could see in my husband's face, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes. I wish my father could have understood that because he really bore this burden of guilt.
Yeah.
So
Everyone
she
you
had
know.
a disenfranchised grief experience she had very serious mental health issues that weren't, addressed and stuff like that. It's the trauma of loss. And when someone takes that from you, it is an intergenerational absolute curse.
It is. And if you don't have a language to express it, as adopted people have not had, then it it's expressed behaviorally.
Right. It's misdiagnosed and called something else.
Yes. And then everyone around
Others
suffers.
will bear the brunt of the burden of it.
Of your, dysregulated, I won't even say dysfunctional behavior, dysregulated behavior, because it is trauma. We are walking around with trauma. I mean, I was talking to you just a moment ago about the photograph of these ancestors, and it grabs me, and I tear up. I mean, I don't know these people. I have no connection to them, except that I do. I have a spiritual, I don't know what you call it. I have a genealogical connection to them that affects me, and it is a dysregulated emotional response that causes other people to be uncomfortable. But I don't know that there's much I can do about that. It just happens.
I have a feeling that I would like to share with you. So I'm quite Jungian in my approach to psychology from when I was very young.
Yeah.
There was a Jungian analytical society, and I was drawn to the idea of collective unconscious.
Yes.
I feel in my own meditations and visions that I, at 57 years of age, feel that I know about myself. Only recently did I have this idea that my collective unconscious, my biological mother appears to definitely be there. I have glimpses of my biological father. However, this is my new idea that might bring comfort to the adoption community. What if we have a collective of adopted people that are looking out for us?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
our biological families and our adoptive families don't seem to understand. But everyone who is adopted, but everyone who was ever adopted and who has passed,
Yeah.
definitely understands.
Absolutely. God, yes.
What if they are part of our collective unconscious? And can we tap into that to give ourselves solace? And I've actually said this in counseling sessions with people with horrible stories that they have now just put on the table for me to counsel them over. And at the end of a session, I'll say something like this: don't ever think for a moment that this horrible story that you have experienced, these tragedies, don't ever think that this has never happened before. It has.
Yeah.
Many others since the beginning of time have felt this way. And I'm saying this to you to comfort you.
Yeah. You
Know that
will
you are not alone in
survive.
your story. You're not alone. This has happened before. I
Yeah.
don't want you to feel alone.
Yeah. I think that's profound.
There are, I mean, think how many millions and millions and
Yeah.
millions for
Yeah.
thousands of years.
Silenced people. Can we just pause for one moment? Would you
Yeah,
mind?
certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, I resumed. But I love that idea of a collective up there, you know, the ocean of us, and how we're different from others, but the same in this regard with them, of that loss. But I think, you know, what you were saying, 1955 is what you can track very, very clearly in your country. Um, the slave trade in North America, the British slave stuff. This is a, this is it. This has this way. This has not been going on
No,
this long.
70 years here under this, in this format. But we are,
This is a 20.
we are just, I mean, I don't know if we're getting anywhere. It feels like we're not, but I do believe we are gaining a voice. I think that is, maybe I just need to believe it, that,
I think it's gonna come out as a great big roar. You know, the universality of it. Individual countries, the
I think so.
universality of it needs to be at the forefront, because
I mean,
it
that's
doesn't
what I
matter
say on
where
my
you are.
Substack, that while the laws are different and I focus a lot on the law, but not just the legislation, but the reason for and how that legislation impacts. And I say that legislation is different in every country, but the intention is the same. And it's that level of intentionality that brings us together, that actually, binds us, because we are all subjects of an overriding intentionality.
I mean, there is tragedy for orphans, of course, before the 20th century that were then, this was the solution to those problems, you know, and in the very beginning, this is what I had said to you. How do you think this? It was because mothers probably came looking for their children and wanted them back, and they wanted to prevent that from being the case in most of the time. And then, of course, somebody started making money off of it. But in relation to the slave trade, of course, there was money there. They were literally selling humans that they brought from somewhere else. And nobody denies this trauma.
Or that it is handed down generation to generation.
So I feel, you know, the African American diaspora, the other marginalized community, the Jewish diaspora of, they're envied the Jews taking their heritage and absolutely steadfastly supporting one another. Never forget. You know, I feel we can't possibly ever forget, but people are just denying that we should even remember.
I mean, one of my
we're trying to be forced to forget something that we can possibly never,
we can't forget, but we're told doesn't exist as well. I mean,
you just have to forget about that.
No, you can't.
Well, you can't.
I mean, one of the things for me that is, I have two plans. Well, I have larger to end adoption in New Zealand, but I don't want to die as an adopted person. I want to die as my original identity, as who I really am. The person I was born with is who I want to die as. So having an adoption overturned is extremely difficult, and I've started that process, and that we'll be following that in the future in my Substack. But the other part of it was, as a step towards that, is so both my parents, and I don't, just to be clear, I don't refer to my adopters as my parents. I refer to them as my male and female adopter, or my adoptive mother or father, if I must. So both my parents, my mother and father, were English, and going back generations, to the one back as far as you can go, and one to 16th century, and then another mid 17th, 18th century. And so I applied under British law. I was born in New Zealand. My mother became pregnant in the UK and ended up coming to New Zealand through a whole series of things while she was pregnant with me. So I was born here. So I'm a citizen of New Zealand. I applied to the Home Office in the United Kingdom to become a British citizen based on my natural mother, based on maternal descent, which my adoption in New Zealand says doesn't exist. I have a birth certificate that says my adopters are my birth parents. I have an original birth certificate that has been defaced by the state that isn't original, but it does have my mother's name on it. And I was able to prove, and last week I gained my British citizenship. And I don't believe anyone else has done that. So it is constitutionally, it's very interesting because it's in direct opposition to the law that binds me as an adopted person, that continues to insist that I am a person that I am not. So I'm finding it a fascinating process of, again, kin-making, reclamation.
Yeah. It was absolutely shattering when I found out I was Irish. My heart just broke open. And not to be acknowledged as a person of Irish descent has bothered me for quite a while. And there's something that keeps popping up on Facebook saying you can apply for Irish citizenship if your grandparents were Irish. And I'm like, I should be able to do that.
Don't you?
Right. Well, I don't have their records, right? And I don't have my original birth certificate. But I think so. 21st century solution
DNA
is that we can go on Ancestry and look at our DNA and be like, look, I'm 75% Irish.
I know. It's an interesting thing. I mean, DNA undoes the secrecy of adoption, and yet it's almost as though they've doubled down on that. Yeah.
It's maybe what was the evils of the 20th century to us as a marginalized community in the 20th century will be undone by technology and the advancements, because I feel like we're in a very rapid evolution. It can be undone very quickly.
I hope so.
Without question. I mean, the United Nations rulings with, trafficking and inhumane, deeming it, I don't even know what I'm referring to right now. We've been talking for quite a while.
I do.
But I think you know what I'm talking about. United Nations rulings recently that the U.S. did not ratify.
Yes, and neither did we. I mean, we have a situation here in New Zealand where recently there was an update to the Succession Act. And, every person who has every person born has a birth certificate, but behind that sits another birth certificate, which is it's called a birth printout, which has all the information that they use to put onto your birth certificate when you order a copy of it, non-adopted people. And for a non-adopted person to access that long form or birth printout, you just apply and pay $25. But in most recent update to the law that just gained royal assent February 2023, or 23, it says that for an adopted person to access that... Are you going?
I'm walking. Are you going to pick me up?
I'll come down and pick you up. For an adopted person to access that long form birth certificate, they must first prove that both their adopters and their birth parents are dead. So it assumes that you know your birth parents. Many don't. So all four have to be dead. You, the adopted person, also has to be dead, or you've turned of 120. Now this is new legislation that has just gone forward, just been instituted. So that's how
somebody just wrote that now.
Those restrictions were written in 1959, and they just
carried it out. That's probably the biggest thing. That's the whole thing right there, is that men whose children were relinquished for adoption don't want to have to bear any responsibility for those children. But that's how it happened. That's how the laws got written. So you and I are women of the 21st century of a certain age. We had no voice in 1955. I wasn't even born yet. Neither were you. That's how these laws were written. That's exactly why they were written. I don't want my biological family to ever have to support the children that were relinquished. It doesn't even enter my head, but yeah, that's why it happened. Oh my goodness, what a twist. It's unbelievable. How do we always come out on the short end of that? Yeah, we haven't even touched on the disenfranchising of women and the misogyny and the entire, well, you had said, the entire burden placed on the woman to make these gigantic, impossible, coerced, horrible decisions because she's given no other options. She's essentially kicked out of society, potentially. My mother was 16 and in Catholic school, and she got yanked out of school and sent away in shame and told, we're going to get rid of it. And you're not going to think about it anymore. And within 15 months of my being born, she had another child with the same man. Rebel against her parents who forced her to relinquish her child. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope we can do something again soon. So I have filed paperwork for a nonprofit called Adoption Evolution, and I'm forming what that's going to become. And I'm sure I'll be talking with people for quite a while about different areas of adoption. But I'm a physician, so like I had said earlier, these risk factors that we carry, I want to open doctors' eyes and providers, therapists too, eyes to the realities and being more adoption informed and literate and not denying the trauma any longer. I think that's definitely a 21st century movement that medical professionals can get behind. That's a big mission for me. And then, of course, adoptology. Like, I think that should be an entire category of research, Barbara. I think it's absolutely a burgeoning major for college. I think we need our own voices, and we can only compare to other movements, etc., like the Me Too movement, etc. And I think we're forming up and talking, and we're approaching a tipping point. Really, I mean, this is not working. This is not working for so many people that are silenced. And then the adoptive mothers as well. You're not going to deny their trauma for much longer. And we're just going to have critical mass, and we're going to be there, unified, very soon, I think. Well, Barbara, if you're coming to Arizona, of course, you must come and see me, and I would love to see you. But let's stay in touch. I'm in love with what you're doing, and I want to share what I'm going to be doing with as many people as possible. So let's do that going forward. I so enjoyed this. It's wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. Let's talk again. Take care.